The wagon seat was hard enough to bruise bone, and Mara Cole had been sitting on it for 11 hours. She'd stopped counting the miles somewhere around midday, when the road stopped being a road and became a suggestion. Two faint ruts pressed into dry grass, curving through scrub brush and red clay, like the land itself couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be traveled. The horse pulling the rented flatbed was a gray gelding with a sway in his back and an opinion about hills, and every opinion he had, he expressed through his feet, slowing, stopping, pulling sideways. Mara had argued with horses before. She'd also lost to them before. By the third hour, she'd stopped arguing. The valley opened up around late afternoon. She didn't expect it to be beautiful. She hadn't expected anything from Grover's Creek except work, and she hadn't been wrong to keep her expectations narrow. The valley was dry, pale, the kind of country that looked like it had survived something and hadn't quite recovered. The mountains to the north were blue and distant. The grass between here and there was the color of old straw. But there was space here, wide, flat, breathing space. And after the last 2 years of cramped boarding houses and smoke-blackened cook fires, and the particular claustrophobia of being someone no one wanted to look at directly, the space felt like something she could use. She had a name written on a folded square of paper in her coat pocket. Caleb Hart. Hart Ranch. East Grover's Creek. Seeking cook and laundress. Inquire at Dennison's store. She had inquired. She had written. She had received a reply that was 3 sentences long and told her nothing except the wage and the start date, which was 4 days ago. She'd been delayed by weather and a broken axle outside of Millhaven, and she wasn't sure whether the job would still be there when she arrived, but she was going anyway because there was nothing behind her worth turning back for. That was the thing about having nothing left. It made decisions simple. Boy, Dennison's store sat at the edge of what passed for town, a general mercantile with a porch that leaned east and a sign that had lost 2 of its letters to weather. A man was sweeping the steps when Mara pulled the wagon up, and he stopped sweeping to look at her with the flat, measuring look that frontier men gave to women traveling alone. Not unfriendly exactly, just calculating the arithmetic of it. "I'm looking for Hart Ranch," she said. "Can you point me?" The man, older, thick-chested, with a beard that was losing the argument against white, set the broom against the railing. "You the woman who wrote? Cook and laundress?" "Mara Cole." "Yes." He nodded, slow. "Thought you weren't coming. Hart had another woman out there 2 days ago, but she left same afternoon she arrived." He said it without commentary, just fact, but his eyes stayed on her face a beat longer than necessary, watching for something. "She say why?" Mara asked. "Didn't need to." Mara waited. The man, Dennison, she assumed, picked up his broom again. "Hart Ranch is 4 miles east. Follow the creek bed until you see the cottonwoods, then turn north. Big place. You'll see the fence line before you see the house." He paused. "He's particular." "I've worked for particular men before." "Not like this one," Dennison said, and went back to sweeping. "What?" The fence line appeared out of the scrub like a statement, straight, tight, well-maintained in a way that the surrounding land wasn't, as if someone had drawn a deliberate border between what was theirs and what was the world's. Mara followed it north until the gate appeared, iron and solid, and past the gate, the ranch house came into view. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, weathered but not neglected, with a long porch running the full front width and a barn set back, and to the east that looked like it had been built by someone who understood how buildings worked under load. Corrals to the south, 3 of them, holding a dozen horses of varying quality and obvious health. She'd seen ranches that looked prosperous and were rotting underneath. This one looked like it was doing what it said. She pulled up at the front gate and climbed down stiffly, her legs uncertain after hours of sitting, and was tying the gelding to the post when the front door opened. The man who came out was not what she'd assembled in her head from the 3-sentence letter. He was younger than she'd assumed, mid-30s at most, with the kind of lean that comes from work rather than shortage. Brown hair that had been pressed flat by a hat that was currently in his hand. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and no more. His face was angular, weathered at the edges, and right now it was doing something she recognized. It was deciding about her before she'd opened her mouth. "Miss Cole," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Hart." She came to the gate and stopped on her side of it. I apologize for the delay. Broken axle outside Millhaven. He looked at her. Then he looked at the wagon. Then back at her. You drive that yourself from Millhaven? There wasn't anyone else to drive it. A pause that wasn't quite a frown, but lived in the same neighborhood. He opened the gate. Come inside. I'll have someone put up the horse. Well, the kitchen was large and functional, with a cast iron stove that had seen serious use and a work table worn smooth in the places that mattered. Caleb Hart stood across from her with his arms at his sides and told her the terms in a voice that had been stripped of anything that might be read as negotiation. The wage, the hours, the meals, 3 a day, simple and filling, nothing fancy, the laundry, twice a week, household linens, and the ranch hand's work clothes. Her room was at the back of the house, past the kitchen, with its own door to the outside. She nodded through most of it. Then he stopped. The pause was different from the others, longer, weighted with something he was measuring the cost of saying. There is one other matter. All right, she said. The hallway at the top of the stairs. He kept his eyes on a point somewhere near her left shoulder. The last door at the end. You will not go near it. You will not go into it. You will not speak to whoever is inside it, unless spoken to first, and that will not happen. You will conduct your work in this house as if that hallway and that door do not exist. Mara said nothing. That is a condition of employment, he said, not a suggestion. She looked at him steadily. I understand. He nodded once, like a door closing. Good. She didn't ask. She could hear the weight of whatever was behind that door in the way he'd said condition of employment, the careful blankness of a man who has had to enforce a boundary so many times that the words have stopped costing him anything. She understood that kind of protection. She'd seen it before, in different shapes. She took the job. The ranch hands numbered 4, and they received her with the polite wariness that men on an all-male ranch usually showed to a woman hired into the house. Not unkind, not quite welcoming. They ate her food that first night in near silence, and what they said about it they said to each other rather than to her, but she heard the word good pass between 2 of them, and that was enough. Her room was small and smelled of cedar and dried grass. There was a window that faced east, a cot with a decent mattress, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for her coat. She'd slept in worse places. She'd slept in much worse places. She lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her, the horses shifting in the barn, the wind against the east wall, the particular silence of a house at night that isn't quite empty. From somewhere above her, faint and brief, and then gone, she heard something. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She almost. In the 2 weeks that followed, Mara learned the rhythm of Hart Ranch the way you learn a river, not by studying it, but by moving alongside it until it stopped surprising you. Caleb Hart was up before light, working until after dark, present and occupied, and not given to conversation that wasn't functional. He said thank you when she set food in front of him, and he said good morning when they passed in the kitchen, and those were more or less the full parameters of their interaction. She didn't push at them. The ranch hands loosened up by the end of the first week. Their names were Dewey, Fletcher, Tom, and a young Mexican boy everyone called Poco, who was 17 and proud of it, and who turned deep red whenever Mara looked at him directly. By the second week, Dewey was leaving her extra firewood by the kitchen door without being asked, and Fletcher had fixed the handle on the laundry tub she'd mentioned was loose, and Tom had started talking to her at breakfast like she was a person rather than a function, which was the only kind of acceptance she'd ever needed. She was good at the work. She had always been good at work. It was one of the things she was allowed to have been good at, and she had long since stopped expecting more permissions than that. She cooked clean, filling food that didn't try too hard. She kept the linens clean and folded in ways that took up less space. She maintained the kitchen without being asked to, and repaired 2 things in the first week that she hadn't been hired to repair, because the alternative was watching them break. She did not go near the hallway. She did not go near the door at the end of it. But at night, not every night, but enough nights that she'd stopped pretending it wasn't a pattern, she heard the sounds. They came from above her, faint, muffled by the ceiling and whatever was between, but present. Not crying, exactly. Nothing as simple as that. More like the sounds a person makes when their body is doing something their mind can't stop. the small, jagged noises of struggle happening in a place where no one is meant to hear it. She lay on her cot and listened with the particular stillness she had learned from her father, who had believed that listening was its own form of diagnosis. You had to go quiet enough to hear what was actually being said, rather than what you expected to hear. What she heard was effort. Someone was trying. She found out about Jonah Hart the way she found out most things on this ranch. From Tom, who was the most forthcoming of the hands, and who did it without seeming to. The way some men talk around things when they think they're talking about other things entirely. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week. She was separating laundry in the yard, and Tom was repairing a section of the corral fence nearby, and the conversation moved in the gradual way conversations do when neither person is directing them. "Boss was different before," Tom said, driving a nail. "More talk in him." Mara kept sorting linens. "What changed?" Tom was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, just choosing his words the way a man does when he's not sure how much the information costs. "Boy had an accident 2 years ago. Horse threw him, and he came down wrong, and that was that." He drove another nail. "Doctor said the spine was damaged, permanent. Boy hasn't walked since." A pause. "He was 8 when it happened." Mara was quiet. "Boss blames himself," Tom continued. "Boy was riding that horse because Hart let him. Hart bought that horse, put him in the saddle, stood watching when it happened." He looked at the nail rather than at Mara. "Man carries that kind of thing and it doesn't leave. Just changes the shape of him." Mara finished folding a towel. She kept her voice neutral. "How old is the boy now?" 10. She didn't say anything else. She didn't ask the question she wanted to ask, because the question she wanted to ask would reveal that she was thinking in a direction she had been explicitly told not to think in. She put the folded towel in the basket, but she was thinking about it. Her father had told her once, she'd been 12, watching him work on a man whose legs had gone dead after a fall from a loading dock, that the body lies about what it's willing to do. That nerve damage wasn't always permanent. That spinal shock could mimic permanent paralysis for years and still carry the possibility of recovery underneath it, buried and waiting if you knew what to look for. He'd had his hands on that man's feet, pressing with his thumbs in the specific points along the heel that Elias Cole had been taught by his own father. And he'd said to her, "You look for the involuntary. The body always tells the truth if you know where to listen for it." The man from the loading dock had walked again, badly, with a cane, but walked. She put it out of her mind. She put it out of her mind every day for the next week. She saw Jonah Hart for the first time through the kitchen window. She'd been washing the noon dishes and had looked up at nothing in particular, just the reflex of a tired mind seeking something. And through the window she could see the side yard and the door that opened from the hallway onto the porch. And that door was open. A wheelchair sat on the porch boards. In it was a boy, small for 10, or maybe he only looked small because the chair was adult-sized, the width of the armrests making him seem narrow and contained. Brown hair like his father's, and his father's jaw. But where Caleb Hart's face was controlled and decided, this boy's face was doing something raw and unresolved. He was looking at the yard with an expression that Mara had no adequate word for. It was not quite anger, though anger lived in it. It was not quite grief, though grief had made its home there too. It was something between the two, the expression of someone who has been told a story about their own life that they don't believe but can't argue against because they don't have better evidence. He sat with a blanket over his legs despite the mild weather, and his hands were on the armrests, and he was absolutely still in the way that people are still when they are doing a great deal of interior work. She made herself look away and finish the dishes, but she thought about his hands on the armrests, the way the knuckles were pressed white against the wood. That was not the stillness of someone who had accepted his situation. That was the stillness of someone pushing against something that wasn't moving. The cracked door was an accident, or rather, it was the result of a draft. She'd opened her window the night before to move air through the kitchen, and when the wind came up after midnight, it moved through the house in the particular way that wind moves through old structures, finding every gap and tunnel and using them. And when she came up to the second floor in the morning to collect the bedding from the hall closet, the door at the end of the hallway was ajar. Not open, just ajar. 4 inches, maybe. She stopped in the hallway with the bundle of clean linens in her arms and looked at the door the way you look at something that you know you're about to make a decision about. She could hear the house around her, the creak of the kitchen below, the distant sound of horses, the ordinary noise of a functioning ranch morning. Caleb Hart had ridden out at dawn. She'd seen him go. The hands were in the south pasture. She stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she walked toward the door. She stopped 2 feet from it and looked through the gap without touching it, without making it wider. Just looked. The room was larger than she'd expected. There was a bed against the south wall, a window facing east with good morning light coming through it, a low table with books. And in the middle of the room, with his back to the door and his chair facing the window, was Jonah Hart. He couldn't have known she was there. He was alone, and his focus was entirely on whatever he was doing, and what he was doing made Mara Cole's breath stop in her chest. He was trying to move his feet, not dramatically, not with great visible effort. He was bent slightly forward in the chair, looking down, and his feet, in their wool socks against the footrest, were trembling. Not spasming, trembling. The particular micro-movement of muscles receiving a signal and failing to fully execute it, like a telegraph message arriving with too much static to be read, but still arriving. She watched him lean forward further, his jaw tight, his entire concentration folded down into the gap between what his mind was telling his body to do and what his body was managing to do in response. His right foot lifted, a fraction, a half inch, maybe less, and came back down. The boy sat back with a small exhale that Mara recognized as the exhale of someone who has been at something for a long time and just failed again. And the sound of it was so particular and so human that she had to press her lips together to stay quiet. She backed away from the door carefully and went back down the hall. Her hands were not entirely steady when she reached the kitchen. She stood at the work table for a long time, looking at the surface of it without seeing it. She was thinking about her father, about the man from the loading dock, about the specific way the boy's foot had lifted. Not a spasm, not random nerve misfiring, but a directed, intentional, effortful movement that had partially succeeded. She was thinking about what that meant, about the difference between a dead pathway and a blocked one, about the things her father had taught her that she had been carrying for years with nowhere to put them. She was also thinking about the word condition and what it cost to violate one and what it cost not to. But she gave herself 3 more days. She spent those days paying the closest possible attention to everything she could observe without crossing the line she'd been given. She watched the way Jonah was carried or wheeled from place to place on the porch. She listened, carefully, from below, to the sounds from his room. She asked Tom, in the most offhand way she could manage, what the doctors had said, and Tom said, permanent paralysis. Mercer from Durham County came out, and some other fellow from up north, and they both said the same thing. Cord damage, no hope of recovery, manage the complications. What kind of complications? She asked. Tom shrugged. Muscle wasting, sores. Boy doesn't sleep right, apparently. Gets pain in his legs sometimes, which they say is strange since he shouldn't be feeling anything. Mara kept her voice easy. That doesn't sound like no feeling. Tom gave her a look. I said the same thing to Hart once. He didn't want to hear it. She nodded and dropped the subject, but she filed it away in the part of her mind that had belonged to her father, pain in the limbs, micro-movement she'd witnessed herself. A child who had been written off by 2 different physicians, but whose body was still sending signals, still fighting the diagnosis, still trying in the dark room at the end of the hall when he thought no one could see him. She thought about the herbs she'd need. Yarrow, which she'd seen growing along the creek east of the fence line. Willow bark, which she'd packed in her travel kit out of habit and hadn't unpacked. Salt. Hot water. The sequence of compression and release along the heel and the arch, the exact pressure her father had demonstrated on the man from the loading dock, and before that on 2 other patients whose files she'd memorized at 15 because her father had handed them to her and said, read these, then ask me questions. She'd read them. She'd asked questions. He'd answered every one. On the 4th day, she made her decision. She gathered the yarrow at dawn, before the ranch was moving. She ground the willow bark with a flat stone she'd cleaned and dried. She prepared the mixture in a small pot on the kitchen fire before the hands came in for breakfast. and she stored it in a cloth-covered clay jar and put the jar in the pocket of her apron. She went upstairs after breakfast, while Caleb Hart was in his office with the door closed and the hands were in the north pasture and the house was as quiet as it got. She stood at the end of the hallway for a long moment, her hand not yet touching the door. Then she knocked. Nothing. Then, "Go away?" The voice was sharper than she'd expected, higher pitched, not a man's voice yet, but practicing to be. She heard the defensiveness in it, the hair-trigger suspicion of someone who'd had people coming to his room for 2 years with solutions that weren't. "My name is Mara Cole," she said through the door. "I'm the cook. I'm not coming in to tell you anything. I'm not coming in to feel sorry for you. I'm coming in because I have something I want to try, and I'd like your permission to try it." A pause. "Father says you're not supposed to come here." "I know." Another pause. Longer. She heard the chair move. "What kind of something?" "Warm water and a couple of plants and some pressure on your feet. I know that probably sounds like nothing. It might be nothing, but I watched my father use it on men who'd been told what you've been told, and twice it wasn't nothing." Silence. "Just twice?" he said, and she could hear in those 2 words the same arithmetic she'd been doing, the weighing of a small chance against the accumulated weight of no chances. "That's all I can promise," she said. "Twice, and my own 2 hands, and the fact that I won't pretend it's more than it is." The silence stretched. Then, "Come in, Tot." The room smelled of camphor and something antiseptic, clinical smells laid over the deeper smell of a room where a child had spent too much time. Jonah Hart sat in his chair facing the window, turned sideways now to face the door, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the yard from the porch, with that expression that was not acceptance, that was the perpetual resistance of someone who hasn't given in, even though everyone around them has. He was small. He was 10 years old and small, and in the light from the east window she could see the hollows in his cheeks that came from too much sitting and not enough of everything else. But his eyes were his father's eyes in the one way that mattered. They were watchful and direct and not willing to be fooled. "You really think it'll work?" he asked. Not hopeful, testing. "I think it's worth trying," she said. "That's different from thinking it'll work." He considered this. "Dad's going to be angry." "I expect so." "He might make you leave." "He might." Jonah looked at her steadily. "Why do it then?" Mara set the clay jar down on the low table and pulled a stool close to the footrest of his chair. She sat on it and looked at him directly, and she said the things she'd decided to say on her walk up the stairs. "Because I watched you try to lift your foot from the hallway 3 days ago. I wasn't supposed to see it, but I did. And what I saw was not a body that's given up." She paused. "I've been carrying something my father taught me for 4 years with nowhere to put it. I think maybe it belongs here." The boy looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." Sam. She worked slowly as her father had taught her. She spoke as she worked. Not chatter, not reassurance, but explanation. She told him what she was doing and why, in plain language without softening it into falseness. She told him about the concept her father had called sleeping pathways, nerves that were shocked into dormancy by trauma, but not severed, not dead, only gone quiet. She told him that this was not a certainty, that it might not work, that if it did work, it would be slow, and it would hurt, because reawakening is not comfortable. "My legs already hurt," Jonah said. "I know, that's actually—" She stopped, choosing her words. "The fact that they hurt is one of the reasons I wanted to try." He looked down at his feet in her hands. Her thumbs were pressing into the heel of his right foot, working the pressure point her father had described. The junction point, Elias had called it, where 3 converging nerve pathways either spoke to each other or stopped. She held the pressure for 8 seconds, released, moved to the next point. "My father's hands are bigger," Jonah said. "That's probably true. He used to—" He stopped. She waited. "He used to teach me to ride," Jonah said. His voice was flat now, the way voices go when the feeling behind them is too large for the available container. "He put me on my first horse when I was 5. He said I had good hands for it." A pause. "He doesn't talk about that anymore." Mara kept her hands on his foot. Steady, deliberate. I imagine it's hard to talk about things that live in the same place as something you wish you could fix. Jonah was quiet. She moved to the arch of his foot, pressing in long, slow strokes from heel to ball the way her father had demonstrated, unlocking rather than forcing, the way you work a stuck door rather than break it. She did the left foot. She came back to the right. She was on the third pass when it happened. It was subtle. His right foot shifted, not a spasm, not involuntary, but a reaction. He inhaled sharply, and she looked up, and Jonah Hart was staring down at his foot with an expression that she had no word for and would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. "That was me," he said, and it came out barely above a whisper. "That was me doing that." Mara kept her hand on his foot, steady. "Yes," she said. "It was." The boy didn't say anything else for a long time. She kept working. Outside, the ranch went about its business. The horses, the fence work, the ordinary noise of an ordinary morning. In the room at the end of the hall, a 10-year-old boy sat with a woman he'd met 4 minutes ago and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something return. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't even close to walking. It was a twitch, a fraction of movement, the barest evidence that the pathway was still there, still waiting, still carrying its quiet signal through the dark. But it was something. And Mara Cole, sitting on a stool in a room she wasn't supposed to be in, with a jar of yarrow water cooling on the table and 2 years' worth of grief and dispossession still in her bones, thought about her father's voice and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that she was precisely where the thing she knew was supposed to be used. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and Caleb Hart did not know. And the door stayed closed behind her, and the ranch moved through its days like a river that doesn't yet know there's a different shape waiting for it downstream. She came back the next morning with warm water in a covered pot, and the yarrow mixture in its clay jar, and the particular kind of quiet that she'd learned to carry in places where she wasn't supposed to be. She knocked twice, soft, the way they'd agreed. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 more. And Jonah said come in before she'd lowered her hand. He was already positioned with his feet off the footrest, which told her he'd been waiting. He wouldn't have admitted that, and she didn't comment on it. She just set the pot on the table and pulled the stool close and got to work. And for a while, neither of them said anything because the silence between them had already settled into something functional rather than uncomfortable. It was on the 4th day that he started talking. Not about his legs, or the accident, or what the doctors had said. He talked the way children talk when they've been alone too long and have forgotten that conversation has rules, circuitously following whatever thread his mind grabbed. He talked about a book he'd read 3 times because it was the only one in the room he hadn't finished. He talked about Poco, who sometimes waved at his window from the yard below, and about how Poco had once brought him a carved horse without saying a word about it, just left it on the windowsill one morning. He talked about the sound the ranch made at night, the way it was different from the sound it made during the day, and how he'd memorized both. Mara listened and worked and said enough to keep the thread moving without redirecting it, because she understood that he wasn't really talking about books or carved horses. He was practicing being a person who still existed. "Do you think it's getting better?" he asked on the 5th morning. Not dramatically, the way you'd ask about weather. She pressed into the heel point and counted to 8. "I think it's changing," she said. "Whether that's better depends on what happens next." "That's not really an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "My father asked Dr. Mercer once if there was any chance. Mercer said that hope was sometimes more damaging than acceptance. He said it flat, like he was reporting something he'd read in a newspaper. Father stopped asking after that." Mara said nothing. She moved to the arch. "Do you think that's true?" Jonah asked. She took a moment before answering because the question deserved one. "I think some people call it acceptance when what they mean is that they've run out of things to try. That's not the same thing." He looked at her sideways. "What if you run out of things to try too?" "Then we'll know," she said. "But we haven't yet." He didn't say anything after that, but she felt the shift in him. A small loosening, like something that had been braced against impact and was deciding, cautiously, that the impact might not be coming from this direction. The improvement was not dramatic. That was the first thing to understand about it, and it was also the thing that would have been impossible to explain to anyone who'd been raised on the idea that healing was either sudden or absent. It happened in increments that required close attention to notice. the kind of increments that looked like nothing from the outside and meant everything from the inside. By the end of the first week of sessions, Jonah could lift his right foot a full 2 inches off the footrest and hold it there for a count of 3 before it came back down. The left foot was slower. Left always was, her father had said. Something to do with hemispheric dominance that he'd explained twice and she'd only half understood. But it was responding. Warmth was returning to areas that had been chronically cold, and the pain, which Jonah reported in the careful underplaying way of someone who'd learned that complaining accomplished nothing, was changing in character. It had been diffuse and constant. It was becoming specific and episodic. Her father had told her that was a good sign. Specific pain meant specific nerve activity. It meant the signal was trying to move through the channel, even if the channel wasn't fully clear yet. She told Jonah this, and he said, "It doesn't feel like a good sign." "I know," she said. "That's the problem with good signs. They don't feel good." He made a face that was the first thing she'd seen from him that looked like what a 10-year-old actually looked like, briefly, unguarded, annoyed in the way children are annoyed rather than the way adults are, which is to say completely and without strategy. Then it was gone, and the careful expression was back, and she thought about what it cost a child to maintain that kind of vigilance all the time, and felt something tighten in her chest that she didn't examine too closely. The secret had a shape and a weight and a particular anxiety that grew as the days accumulated. She kept the clay jar hidden in the bottom of the kitchen's dry goods shelf behind a sack of cornmeal, and she kept the yarrow drying in the cedar box she'd brought from her room, and she kept the schedule of sessions timed to the rhythm of the ranch. Always when Caleb Hart was occupied and the hands were in the pastures, and the house had that particular mid-morning emptiness that lasted for roughly 90 minutes between chores. She was not comfortable with it. That was important to acknowledge, at least to herself. She had never been the kind of person who deceived easily or well. Her father had taught her that honesty was a form of precision, that saying the untrue thing was like using the wrong tool and hoping it worked anyway. She did not like moving through the house with something hidden. She did not like the calculations she made every morning about what Caleb Hart knew and didn't know, and when that might change. But she also lay awake some nights and thought about that 2-inch lift and the count of 3, and the calculation always ended the same way. Tom noticed something on a Wednesday in the 3rd week. She was in the yard hanging laundry, and he was repairing a saddle on the porch steps, and he looked at her for a moment too long, with the particular expression of a man who is almost asking a question. "You're going up to the house a lot in the mornings," he said, without inflection. Mara pinned a sheet to the line. "Kitchen needs attention in the mornings." "Kitchen's downstairs," Tom said. She looked at him. He looked at his saddle. "Tom," she said. "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm just telling you to be careful." He paused. "Hart's not a bad man, but he's got a wall around that particular room that you'd need a county's worth of dynamite to get through, and I've seen 2 other people try and get fired for it." He looked up at her. "One of them was a doctor. What happened to the doctor?" "Hart told him to leave and stood on the porch until the man's wagon was off the property." Tom went back to the saddle. "He doesn't do halfway when it comes to the boy." Mara finished pinning the sheet. "I appreciate you telling me." "I didn't tell you anything," Tom said. The session on the 22nd day was the one that changed the arithmetic of everything. She'd come in at the usual time, knocked the usual knock, settled onto the usual stool. Jonah was quieter than he'd been lately. There was something pulled inward about him, his jaw set in a way she recognized as the preparation for pain. His legs had been aching through the night, he said. Worse than usual. "That's the nerves," she said. "The pathway's widening. It's going to hurt while it does." "You could have led with that information weeks ago," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "I thought you might quit." "I'm not going to quit." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now." He looked at her. There was something in the look that was not quite the child she'd first walked in on, the sharp-tongued, suspicious boy with the locked-down face. 2 weeks of early mornings had done something to that. Not made him trusting. He wasn't built for easy trust, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But made him something more specific than wary. He had the look of someone evaluating based on evidence rather than assumption. "My father was sick when he was young," he said, unexpectedly. "He doesn't talk about it, but Dewey told me once. Something with his back when he was a boy. He recovered." A pause. "I used to think that meant I would too, that it ran in the family or something. Mara kept her hands on his foot, steady. What changed? 2 years of being told it didn't work that way, Jonah said. She thought about what Tom had told her about Elias Cole treating a man from a loading dock accident. She thought about what Dewey might know about Caleb Hart's childhood injury. She filed it away. Not the time, not yet, but a thread she could see the end of. She began the sequence on his left foot, working through the heel points in order, and she was midway through the second set when his foot moved. Not a twitch this time. His left foot flexed, deliberately, the toes curling down and then lifting, the whole foot alive in her hands in a way that made her grip loosen involuntarily and then firm back up. Jonah had gone completely still above her. She could hear him breathing. That was, he started. Yes, she said. Both of them, he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized as the sound of someone who has been very careful not to want something for a very long time and is now in the presence of the thing they weren't allowing themselves to want. I felt both of them. Mara kept her hands where they were. She didn't celebrate. She understood, from watching her father, that celebration was a form of pressure, and pressure was the last thing a newly reopening system needed. She kept her voice steady and said, "Good, keep breathing." "I am breathing." You stopped for a second. He exhaled and it came out unsteady, and she looked up and the boy's face was doing something she had no polite way to describe. It was breaking. Not into sadness, but into something more fundamental than sadness, some bedrock response that lives below the names we have for feelings. His eyes were wet and his jaw was set, and he was very clearly refusing to let the wet eyes become anything more than that, which told her everything she needed to know about what 2 years in that room had asked of him. She looked back down at his feet and kept working. She said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do is not make a person perform composure. They're still assembling. After a while, he said, "Don't tell my father." "I wasn't planning to." "He'll make it into something it isn't yet." A pause. "Or something it is, and he can't handle." Mara moved through the final points of the sequence, slow and deliberate. "He loves you," she said. "Not as comfort, as fact." "I know," Jonah said. "That's kind of the problem, isn't it?" She thought about that on her way back downstairs, the clay jar in her apron pocket and the morning light coming sideways through the kitchen window. She thought about the particular way love becomes its own obstacle when the person doing the loving can't bear the cost of being wrong. Caleb Hart had heard 2 doctors say permanent, and he had built his entire adjustment to his son's life on that word. And the word had become the architecture of his grief and his guilt. And you could not pull one brick of it out without threatening the whole structure. She understood that. She didn't know yet what to do about it. What she didn't know was that Caleb Hart was beginning to notice. Not the sessions. He didn't know about those, not specifically, not yet. But he was a man who paid attention to his ranch the way a good stockman pays attention to his animals. Not through constant surveillance, but through accumulated small observations that assembled into patterns over time. And the pattern he was assembling involved Mara Cole. He noticed that she was quiet in a specific way that was different from the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. He noticed that she went upstairs in the mornings more than the work required. He noticed that his son, who had been getting through the days in the grim mechanical way of someone enduring rather than living, had started, almost imperceptibly, but noticeably to a man who watched, to seem less mechanical. Not better, not hopeful. Just somehow more present. The way a room seems different when a window has been opened, even before you can feel the air. He noticed these things and did nothing with them, because the alternative was to acknowledge them. And acknowledgement was a country he'd been staying out of. He had tried, in the first year after the accident, everything the county and the region had to offer. 2 physicians, a man who claimed expertise in nerve injuries and came from the East Coast with a large bag and a larger fee, a woman in Mill Haven who worked with water therapies and achieved nothing except Jonah's profound misery and a 3-week infection from equipment that wasn't properly cleaned. He had tried each of these things with the determined optimism of a man who believes that persistence and money can solve most problems, and each of them had failed, and each failure had added its weight to the pile. And by the time Dr. Mercer came out and said what he said, Caleb Hart had spent 18 months collecting failures, and he had made the choice that men make when the cost of hope becomes higher than the cost of giving it up. He had accepted. He had reorganized his entire relationship with his son around that acceptance. He had told himself it was strength. He had told himself it was what the boy needed. A father who dealt in reality, not wishes. He had built a careful structure of management and routine and reduced expectation, and he had lived inside it. And it worked. In the way that things work when you define the parameters narrowly enough that failure becomes impossible. The problem with a structure built on a particular version of the truth is that it doesn't survive contact with a different version. He came back from the south pasture on a Thursday afternoon and went to the kitchen for water, and Mara was there. And there was something about the way she was standing, turned slightly away from the door, a small and involuntary posture of someone reorienting from somewhere else, that made him stop in the doorway. "Miss Cole," he said. She turned. "Mr. Hart, water's fresh? I just drew it." He crossed to the bucket and ladled himself a cup and drank it, and set the cup down and looked at her with the flat measuring look he'd given her the day she arrived. It was a look that had gathered more information than he'd shared conclusions about. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" he asked. The pause she gave him was exactly 1 beat longer than the pause that would have been innocent. He catalogued that. He catalogued the way her hand settled against the work table edge, not gripping, but resting there like they needed the anchor. "About what?" she said. Not defiant, careful. "About anything," he said. The silence in the kitchen was its own kind of conversation. She looked at him steadily. She had, he'd noticed from the beginning, the particular directness of someone who has been in enough bad situations to have stopped flinching from the anticipation of them. Whatever she was holding, she held it without showing the seams. "The biscuits tomorrow are going to need more salt," she said. "I've been finding the balance on that." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Good to know," he said, and took his hat off the hook and went back outside. She understood that the conversation had been a warning, not an accusation. He didn't have enough yet for that, and she suspected he was a man who didn't make accusations without evidence because he didn't like being wrong. But it was a narrowing, a signal that his attention had located something it hadn't identified. She told Jonah about it the next morning because she thought he deserved to know. "He suspects," she said. Jonah absorbed this. He was trying to lift his right foot, which he could now do reliably to approximately 4 inches, and he kept the effort going while he thought about what she'd said. What happens when he knows? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Will you leave?" She pressed into the junction point. "I'm not planning to." That's also not really an answer. "No," she agreed. "But it's the one I have." He let his foot down, rested, tried again. The concentration on his face was different now than it had been 3 weeks ago. Less desperate, more technical, the focus of someone working a problem rather than fighting a war. That shift had happened gradually, and it was one of the things that told her the work was reaching something deeper than the muscles. "He's going to be angry," Jonah said. "Probably. At you more than me." "That's fair," she said. "It was my choice." Jonah was quiet for a moment, his foot in her hands. The morning light coming in full and warm through the east window and laying itself across the floorboards in a way that made the room look different from the room it had been 3 weeks ago. Or maybe the room was the same and they were different in it. "Why did you?" he asked. "Choose it." She thought about her father, about the ledgers and the cattle and the kitchen table where Elias Cole had kept his herb cases and his patient files in orderly rows, and about the particular quality of attention he'd given to everything that came to him, the way he'd looked at a man who was hurting with the same careful specificity that a good carpenter looks at a joint that isn't sitting right. Not pity, just precision and willingness. "Because your father wasn't going to," she said finally, "and someone had to." It was reductive, and it wasn't the whole truth, but it was the part of the truth that was available to say out loud, and Jonah received it with the same measuring look his father had, except where Caleb Hart's look was defended, Jonah's was open. "Okay," he said, and then, 4 inches. "I know," she said. "Keep going." The yarrow ran out on a Sunday, and she went to the creek bed at dawn to gather more, and she was crouched in the wet grass with her apron full when she looked up and found Caleb Hart standing on the bank above her. He was still in his early morning clothes, no hat, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked down at her in the creek bed with the yarrow piled in her apron and said nothing for a long moment. She straightened up carefully, The bank was 3 feet above her and he was standing at the edge of it, and the position was not, in itself, comfortable. She looked up at him and waited. "Yarrow," he said. "Yes." "You went through your kitchen stock?" The kitchen did not stock Yarrow. They both knew this. The pause that followed was the kind of pause that stands in for a conversation that hasn't happened yet. "I use it for different things," she said, which was true and which she'd selected for exactly that reason. He looked at her for a long time. The morning was cool and gray, and the creek moved behind her with its steady, indifferent noise. "Different things," he said. "Yes." He drank his coffee. He looked at the yarrow in her apron. He looked at her face, which she kept neutral with the practice of a woman who had spent 4 years in situations where showing the wrong thing had consequences. Then he turned and walked back toward the house without another word. She stood in the creek bed until he was gone, and then she sat down on the bank and let out a breath that had been sitting in her lungs for approximately 2 minutes. Her hands were cold from the water and the morning air, and she held them together and thought very carefully about the shape of the days ahead. She had bought time. She didn't know how much. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was what happened after Caleb Hart walked back into the house that morning. He went to his office, a room he'd built for ranch records, but which had become, over the years, the room he retreated to when the rest of the house was more than he could be in. And he sat behind the desk, and he put down the coffee, and he did not open the ledger in front of him. He sat there. He thought about Yarrow and what Yarrow was used for, and he thought about the way his son had looked at the kitchen window 2 days ago when Mara was in the yard below. Not the flat, enduring look, but something sharper and more present. And he thought about what Tom had not quite said to him a week ago. The carefully incomplete sentence that Hart had chosen not to complete because completing it would have made it real. He thought about the morning after the accident, the white room in the county physician's office, the specific word the doctor had chosen. He thought about the way a man builds around a word like that, the scaffolding of adjusted expectation and modified grief. And he thought about what it feels like when someone starts to test the scaffolding without asking permission. He pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk and took out a file he hadn't opened in 2 years. Ranch records, mostly. But underneath the ranch records was something else, an old account book, its cover soft with age, and in it a record of medical treatments dating back to his own childhood. He'd kept it because his father had kept it. He'd never read it carefully. He read it now. The entry was dated 23 years ago. It was brief: a child's name, the nature of an injury, and the name of the practitioner who had treated it. The treatment had involved yarrow and warm water, and pressure applied in sequence to specific points along the heel and the arch of the foot. The practitioner's name was Elias Cole. Caleb Hart sat very still for a very long time. Then he closed the account book, put it back in the drawer, and sat there in the gray morning light with his coffee going cold, and whatever he was doing with his face in that empty room, there was nobody there to see it. He didn't confront her that day, or the next. Caleb Hart moved through the following 48 hours with the careful deliberateness of a man who has received information that requires processing before it requires action, and Mara watched him do it from the kitchen, from the yard, from the corner of every room they happened to occupy at the same time. He was not cold to her. He was, if anything, more present than usual, more aware of her movements, which was its own kind of pressure. He said good morning. He thanked her for meals. He did not mention Yarrow or the creek bed or the account book she didn't yet know he'd found. She kept going to the room at the end of the hall. Jonah was making progress that she had no adequate language for, not because it was miraculous, but because it was so specifically, painstakingly earned that the ordinary words for progress felt too light for it. He could lift both feet now to 4 inches with reliable control. He had sensation returning in the outer edges of his calves, which manifested as a deep burning ache that woke him some nights, and that he reported to her each morning with the same flat understatement he applied to everything. His circulation had improved enough that the chronic coldness in his lower legs had diminished by roughly half. She could see the color change when she worked. Not dramatic, just the difference between dead pale and the faint pink of tissue receiving blood. None of this was walking. She was careful to keep that distinction clear, especially with Jonah, who was 10 years old and whose mind had a tendency to want to jump from something, is happening to therefore everything will be fine, which was a tendency she understood and couldn't afford to indulge. How long? he asked on a Tuesday morning, his right foot lifted and holding, the effort visible in the set of his jaw. I don't know, she said. Your father's recovery took months, from what I understand. He let his foot down and looked at her. You know about that? She decided on the way upstairs that morning to tell him. He was 10, not 6, and he was living in the middle of something that concerned him more than anyone. And the habit adults had of deciding what information children could handle was one of the things she'd found most infuriating about her own childhood. I know that your father had a similar injury when he was young and recovered from it. I know that Elias Cole, my father, was the one who treated him. Jonah was very still. Your father treated my father. A long time ago. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he said, Does my father know that? I don't know what your father knows right now, she said honestly. Jonah was quiet for a moment, turning something over. That's why you were sure, he said finally, that it would work. It's not just that you'd seen it twice, it worked on him. I didn't know that when I started, she said. I found out after. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not agreeing but accepting. Then he reached forward and pressed his own thumbs into the heel of his right foot, approximating the pressure point she'd shown him, and said, Show me how to do the next one. She looked at him. If you get fired, he said, with the particular practicality of a child who has learned to plan for bad outcomes, I need to be able to keep going. She moved his thumbs to the correct position and showed him. Buki. The man arrived on a Thursday. He came in a good wagon with a matched pair of bays and a black leather bag, and he wore a dark coat and a hat that was too clean for the country. And Mara watched him come up the drive from the kitchen window with a feeling in her stomach that she recognized as the feeling of something she couldn't stop that was already in motion. Dr. Silas Mercer was not what she'd assembled from Tom's description. Tom had implied a man of ordinary confidence and ordinary limitations. What came up the porch steps was something more specific than that. A man in his 50s who had been right a great many times and had organized his entire personality around that fact. He had the kind of authority that comes not from wisdom, but from the uninterrupted experience of being deferred to, and he wore it the way some men wear good boots, without noticing it anymore, because it had become simply the ground he walked on. Caleb Hart met him at the door. They shook hands with the ease of men who have a history, and Mara heard their voices in the front room, low, purposeful, the voice of a man explaining something and the voice of another man receiving it. She could not hear the words. She didn't need to. She kept her hands busy at the work table and thought about what to do. She had roughly 1 hour before Mercer went upstairs. In that hour, she could do nothing, which was the safe choice. Or she could go up first, which was not safe, but was the choice that had the advantage of letting her tell Jonah what was happening before the man with the black bag and the professional certainty walked into his room. She went up. She knocked once, just once, no code, no pause, and opened the door without waiting, because there wasn't time for their usual ritual. Jonah looked up from his book with the beginning of a question on his face, and she said quietly, Dr. Mercer is here. Your father brought him. The beginning of the question resolved into something harder. To assess me. I'd assume so, because of you. She came in and closed the door behind her. Probably because of a lot of things. Your father's been paying attention. Jonah put his book down on the table. His jaw was set in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of bracing for impact. Not fear, exactly, but the deliberate assembly of a surface that wouldn't crack under pressure. He was 10 years old and already knew how to do that, which told her more about the last 2 years than any medical file could have. What does Mercer say about me? He asked. What will he say? He'll say what he's already said before, Mara told him. Permanent damage. No recovery pathway. He believes it. But he's wrong. He's looking at a different version of what's happening in your body than the one that's actually there, she said carefully. That doesn't make him dishonest. It makes him limited. Jonah considered this. Is there a difference? A large one, she said, though it won't feel like it when he's talking. She looked at him. The boy in the chair, the wool blanket, the east window with its reliable morning light, and she said the thing that needed to be said before she ran out of time to say it. When he examines you, don't perform. Don't try to show him what you can do. Let him see what he expects to see. Jonah frowned. Why? Because what you can do right now is not enough to convince him, and trying and falling short will give him something to use. She held his gaze. What you're building is real, but it's not ready to be argued about yet. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, the kind of nod that means I don't like this, but I understand it. Mara, he said, which was the first time he'd used her name without a prompt. Yes. Don't let them send you away. She wanted to say something reassuring. She'd been around enough of the world to know that reassurance was a form of debt. You made the promise, and then the circumstances collected on it one way or another, and the person you'd promised ended up worse off for having believed you. She kept her mouth honest. I'll do what I can, she said. She was back in the kitchen before Mercer came down from the front room. The examination lasted 40 minutes. She knew this because she counted the clock on the kitchen shelf, moving through her work with the kind of methodical attention that was the only thing available to her while she waited. She prepared the midday meal. She kneaded bread. She washed the morning's dishes twice because she'd lost track of whether she'd washed them once. When Mercer came downstairs, he came to the kitchen. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to go back to the front room, back to Caleb, back to the professional consultation that did not involve the cook. But the kitchen door opened and he stood in the doorway with his black bag in one hand and his hat in the other, and he looked at her with a precise and particular focus that told her he'd come specifically here. You're the woman Hart hired, he said. Cook and laundress, she said. Yes. He came into the kitchen. He was the kind of man who moved into rooms as if he'd been invited, who assumed the space would accommodate him because it always had. He set his bag on the chair by the door, her chair, but she didn't say that, and looked at her with a physician's assessment that had somewhere along the way become indistinguishable from a prosecutor's. How long have you been going to the boys' room? He asked. She turned to face him fully. There was no point in the indirect approach with this man. He hadn't come in here to be deflected. Several weeks, she said. What have you been doing? Warm water, yarrow, pressure application along the nerve points in his feet and lower legs. He was quiet. The quiet of a man who is rearranging what he thought he walked in knowing. Who taught you that? My father. Elias Cole. Something moved across his face. Recognition, she thought, though whether he'd known her father or only the name, she couldn't tell. He covered it quickly. Your father was not a licensed physician. No, she said. He was a man who knew a great deal about how the body repairs itself when you give it the right conditions. The boy's condition is permanent, Mercer said. It came out with the flatness of something he'd said so many times, it had stopped requiring inflection. The spinal cord damage is not recoverable. Whatever you believe you've observed, he lifted his feet 6 inches yesterday, she said. Both of them. Under his own control, with specific intention, for a count of 4. Mercer's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind it shifted. She could see it, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man encountering a fact that doesn't fit his model and deciding in real time what to do with it. Involuntary muscle response, he said. Spasm, common in cases of nerve disruption. It wasn't a spasm, she said. You're not qualified to make that distinction. No, she said, but I know what I saw. He looked at her with the particular patience of someone explaining to someone they consider slower. Miss Cole? I understand the impulse, genuinely. When people care for the ill, they want to see improvement, and the mind will find it even when the body doesn't provide it. It's a well-documented phenomenon. He picked up his bag. You are not helping that child. You are raising his expectations in a way that will cause him considerable harm when reality reasserts itself. And if reality has already changed, she said. He stopped. What if the reality you certified 2 years ago is not the current reality, she said. What does a doctor do with that? Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he put on his hat. I'm going to recommend to Mr. Hart that your employment be terminated, he said. I'm telling you this directly because I believe in directness. You have done this family no service, and I suspect you know it. He left the kitchen. She stood at the work table and listened to his boots on the front room floor, and the low voices again, and then the front door, and then the wagon starting down the drive. She went back to the bread she'd been kneading. Her hands were shaking slightly. She worked through it. Caleb Hart came to the kitchen that evening after the hands had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet. He came without warning, the way he always did. But this time he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he came in, a beat of hesitation that was unlike him, a crack in the habitual precision with which he moved through his own house. He sat down at the table. He did not do that often. He was a man who ate standing or in motion more than sitting, and the act of sitting down at the kitchen table while Mara was still in the room had a quality of deliberateness to it. "Mercer says I should let you go," he said. "I know," she said. "He told me he was going to say that." Caleb looked at the table. "He says what you've been doing is dangerous, raises expectations that can't be met, causes psychological harm to the boy." "He believes that," she said. "Do you?" It wasn't quite a question. She turned from the stove to face him. He was looking at his hands on the table, not at her, which was unusual for a man who generally used eye contact as a tool. "I believe Jonah lifted his feet 6 inches yesterday," she said. "Both of them. With intention. I believe the sensation in his lower legs has improved significantly over 5 weeks. I believe he is not where he was when I arrived, and I believe that is not a coincidence." Caleb was quiet. "I also believe," she said, "that you have been living inside a version of your son's future that was given to you by someone who was doing his best with the information he had. And I think you've built a great deal of your life around that version, and I understand why, and I am not unaware of what it costs to have someone suggest it might be wrong." He looked up at her then. "My father treated a man with a similar injury to Jonah's," she said. "Twice I watched it. The improvement was not immediate, and it was not total, but it was real. My father also—" She stopped. "Your father's account book. The treatment from 23 years ago. Yarrow and warm water and pressure points. My father's name is in that record." The silence in the kitchen was complete. The clock on the shelf counted it. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with its flat, neutral sound. Caleb Hart's face was doing something that she could only describe as the expression of a man whose scaffolding is being tested and who has not yet decided whether to reinforce it or let it fall. "Mercer says the treatment is fraudulent," he said. His voice was quieter now. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. "Mercer has built his professional authority on a diagnosis," she said. "If that diagnosis is wrong, it costs him something. That doesn't make him a bad man. It makes him human." Caleb stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard. She waited. "If I let this continue," he said to the window, "and it fails, the boy goes through whatever this is, the pain, the raised expectations, and then it fails. What does that do to him?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer. And if I stop it, then we know what happens, what's been happening for 2 years." He turned around. The lamplight from the shelf caught the side of his face, and she could see in it the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has been careful never to put it down where anyone could see, because putting it down meant admitting the weight of it. "He's been different," Caleb said. "The last few weeks. I noticed." He said it like it was a thing he'd been holding and had decided to set on the table between them. "More awake somehow, less—" He stopped. "I thought it was my imagination." "It wasn't," she said. He looked at her for a long time. "Mercer is going to send a formal complaint," he said. "Unlicensed medical practice. Interference. He has the standing to do it. I know. It could involve the sheriff. I know that too." "And you're still here." She looked at him steadily. "I'm still here." Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. He picked up his hat from the table. He'd put it down when he came in, which she realized now she'd never seen him do. And he held it for a moment, turning it in his hands with the habitual motion of a man thinking. "Go to bed, Miss Cole," he said. "Are you—" "Go to bed?" She went to bed. She lay on her cot in the cedar-smelling room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house. She heard him in the kitchen for a while. The particular sounds of a man sitting alone with his thoughts, the slight movement of the chair, the sound of a cup being set down. She heard him go upstairs eventually, heard him stop in the hallway. She didn't hear the door at the end of it open, but she didn't hear him walk past it either. She lay there and waited for the sound of whatever came next, and eventually she slept, and whatever Caleb Hart did at the end of that hallway, He did it alone in the quiet of the sleeping house. Dr. Mercer sent the complaint 4 days later. It arrived by post, addressed to the Durham County Sheriff's Office, and Dennison at the Mercantile, who was the informal hub of information in Grover's Creek in the way that mercantile owners in small frontier communities always were, told Tom about it, and Tom told Mara, and Mara was standing at the kitchen stove when Tom came in from town and said quietly, "They're talking about coming out to assess the situation." She stirred the pot on the stove and said, "When?" 2-3 days. Maybe less." She nodded. Tom stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "What do you want to do?" "Keep working," she said. He looked at her. "That's the plan?" "That's the plan." He turned his hat over twice. He was a man who expressed doubt through small, repetitive motion rather than words, which she'd noticed in the first week and come to read fairly accurately. He turned the hat twice more. Then he said, "All right," and put it back on and went back outside. She went upstairs after breakfast. Jonah knew. She could tell when she came through the door. There was something heightened in his posture, a readiness that was also anxiety, the two things running together the way they often did in people who were waiting for something bad. "I heard Tom and Dewey talking," he said, "about the sheriff." "Yes," she said. "Is that because of me?" She sat on the stool. "It's because of me. Because I made a choice about which rules were worth following and which weren't, and now there are consequences for that choice. That's not about you." He looked at her with the look she'd come to think of as his assessment face, the one that was his father's in form, but his own in content, the one that was doing real work rather than performing evaluation. "Are you scared?" She thought about it. "A little," she said. "More practical than scared. There are things I can't control and things I can." "Which ones can you?" She picked up his foot. "This," she said. "Right now. This is what I can control." He reached forward and pressed his own palm flat against his right shin, not the heel point, just holding his leg with his hand, and said, "I want to try standing." She looked at him. "Not now," he said quickly. "Not without you here, but I want to try. My legs feel different. They feel like they're mine again, not all the way, but more than before." She held his foot in her hands and thought about timing and risk, and the particular cruelty of a good thing happening at the wrong moment. The sheriff coming in 2 or 3 days, Mercer's complaint on record, Caleb Hart navigating something that had no clean resolution, and a 10-year-old boy who could feel his legs again and wanted to use them. "Let's build to it," she said. "I want you stronger in the ankles before we try weight bearing. If you go down, we lose ground we've spent 5 weeks earning." He nodded. He didn't like it. She could see that, but he nodded. "Mara," he said. "Yes." "If they send you away." He stopped. Then, "I've been practicing the heel point on myself, at night, after the lamp goes out." She looked at him. "You showed me where to press," he said. "I've been doing it. I didn't want to tell you in case you thought it was too much." A pause. "Is it too much?" She thought about the jar of yarrow in the apron pocket. She thought about Elias Cole, sitting at the kitchen table with his patient files in orderly rows. She thought about what it meant to give someone a skill versus giving them a treatment, the difference between something that lived in her hands and left when she did, and something that lived in his. "It's exactly right," she said. So, on the second day after Tom's warning, Caleb Hart went up to his son's room. Not for the session. Mara had already been that morning, and it was late afternoon, the blue-gray hour when the ranch light went flat, and the day started its slow relinquishment. She was in the kitchen, and she heard his boots on the stairs, heard them stop at the end of the hall, heard the knock that was different from her knock, slower, heavier, with the weight of a man who hasn't been on the other side of that door in months. She heard Jonah's voice say something she couldn't make out. She heard the door open. She kept her hands on the work table and did not move. She could not hear what was said between them. The house walls and the distance were enough to muffle everything into tone rather than words, and she was glad of that, because what happened in that room was not hers to hear. She could tell that the conversation was long, and that it moved through different registers. She could tell from the intervals and the shifts in volume, from the silence that fell in the middle of it, that lasted several minutes, and resolved into something that sounded quieter and more even than what had preceded it. After 40 minutes, Caleb Hart came back downstairs. He went to the front room. She heard the desk drawer open. She heard papers moving. Then he came to the kitchen doorway and stood there, and she turned to look at him, and his face was the face of a man who has put down something very heavy and is not sure what his arms feel like without the weight. "He showed me," Caleb said. She waited. He lifted his feet, both of them. He stopped. His voice was controlled, but controlled the way a river is controlled by a dam. The pressure visible behind the surface. "He's been doing it himself. At night, he showed me the pressure point." Another stop. "He said you taught him so he could keep going if you left." Mara said nothing. "My son," Caleb said, "taught me a pressure point on my own heel this afternoon." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, briefly, before looking back at her. "He was teaching me something." "Yes," she said. "He hasn't—" He stopped again. She watched him find his way through whatever was in there. "He hasn't been that, like himself, in a long time." "I know," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of a man who has been wrong about something important and is deciding what to do about it rather than denying it. It was not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of. It was also one of the most honest things she'd seen on a human face in 4 years. "The sheriff is coming day after tomorrow," he said. "I know. Mercer's complaint says unlicensed medical interference, endangerment." He said it flatly, the words drained of their charge by whatever had happened upstairs. "The formal language is serious. It's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not. I'm not going to let them take you off this property," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know yet exactly how," he said, "but I'm not going to let that happen. I want to be clear about that before the day ends." It was not a graceful speech. It didn't try to be. It was the speech of a man unaccustomed to the kind of admission it contained, delivered with the difficulty that kind of admission requires from that kind of man, and it landed precisely because of those qualities rather than in spite of them. "Mr. Hart," she said. "Caleb," he said, which was the first time he'd offered it. She nodded. "Caleb." Then, "I want to try standing tomorrow with Jonah. I think he's ready, and I think we should do it before the sheriff comes. Not because it will resolve the legal matter, but because he needs to know he can." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you do it?" "The standing." "I'll need you there," she said. "2 people, in case he goes down." He stood in the doorway, and something moved across his face that she couldn't fully name. Not hope, that was too clean a word for what it was, but something related to hope the way the gray before dawn is related to sunrise. The same direction. Not there yet. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Together." They met at the end of the hall at 8 in the morning, the 3 of them. Mara with her clay jar and the certainty she had been tending for 5 weeks. Caleb with his hands ready at his sides and his face doing its best to hold whatever was behind it. And Jonah in his chair, with the expression of someone about to step off a known edge into unknown territory. Terrified and decided in equal measure, the 2 things so thoroughly mixed they'd become a single state. She set up the standing attempt the way her father had taught her. Footrest lowered, body weight shifted forward gradually. The chair positioned so there was something to hold on both sides. She showed Caleb where to stand and how to spot without gripping, support without controlling. "When you feel your feet under you," she told Jonah, "don't try to push up all at once. Let the weight come in slow. Your ankles are going to shake. That's fine. We're not going for 10 seconds. We're going for 2. Jonah looked at her. Then he looked at his father. Caleb said, and it came out rough and simple, without any of the careful maintenance she'd come to expect from him. "I've got you." Jonah looked at him for a moment. 2 words carrying the weight of 2 years, and both of them knowing it. He leaned forward. He put his feet on the floor. He pressed down. He shook. His ankles turned, corrected, turned again. His hands gripped the armrests and then released them, reaching for what? She wasn't sure. Maybe just reaching the way humans reach when they're between 2 states of being, neither one safe. Caleb's hands were there at his sides, not touching, ready. Mara's hands were at his waist, barely present, and then Jonah Hart was standing, not straight, not stable. He was vibrating with the effort of it, his whole body engaged in the tremendous work of doing what bodies are supposed to be able to do without thinking about it. And his face was white with the effort and the pain of reawakened weight bearing down on structures that hadn't carried weight in 2 years. He stood. For 3 seconds, she counted 1, 2, 3. He stood. Then his knees buckled and she caught him and eased him back, and he was in the chair again, shaking and breathing hard, and for a moment none of them said anything. Caleb Hart was standing 2 feet away with his hands at his sides, and his face was... She looked away, because the expression on a man's face when something he thought was lost for good arrives back in the room is not something you look at. You give it room. Jonah was staring at the floor in front of his chair where his feet had just been. Then he looked up at his father. 3 seconds, he said. 3 seconds, Caleb said. His voice was barely there. I'm going to get to 5 tomorrow, Jonah said. Caleb crouched down in front of his son's chair. Not gracefully, just down to his son's level with the speed of someone who stops calculating the dignity of a gesture and just makes it. And he put his hand on the back of Jonah's head the way parents do when the words have run out. Jonah leaned into it. Mara picked up her clay jar and walked to the window and looked out at the morning valley and let the two of them have the room for a moment, because some things need space before they can be what they actually are. Outside, the land was flat and dry and ordinary and enormous. And somewhere out along the eastern fence, the creek was running, and the cottonwoods were doing what they always did, and none of it had changed. But in the room behind her, 3 seconds had changed the direction of everything. The sheriff was still coming. The complaint was still on record. The legal machinery that Mercer had set in motion was not going to stop because a boy stood up in a room on a frontier ranch for the count of 3. None of that had resolved. But something had. Caleb Hart had been in the room. He had seen it with his own eyes, and his hands had been ready to catch his son, and his son had stood. And those 3 seconds were now a fact in the world that nobody, not Mercer, not the sheriff, not the accumulated weight of 2 years of professional certainty, could reach back into and change. She stood at the window and let herself feel that, just for a moment. Then she went back to work. The sheriff arrived at 9:30 on a Thursday morning, which was not the most convenient time and also not the worst. Mara was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon, and she wiped her hands on her apron and stood still for a moment, just breathing, before she went to the window to look. There were 2 of them. Sheriff Aldous Crane was a man she'd seen once in town, broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, with the unhurried movement of someone who had learned that most situations resolved themselves if you didn't accelerate them. The man beside him was younger, a deputy she didn't know, thin and watchful. And behind their wagon, arriving separately in the matched bays and the too-clean coat, was Dr. Silas Mercer. She had expected Mercer. She had not expected the expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who believes he is about to resolve something. Caleb Hart went out to meet them on the porch. She watched through the kitchen window as he shook the sheriff's hand, not warm, but not hostile, the handshake of a man who has decided how much courtesy to extend and is extending exactly that amount. He did not shake Mercer's hand. Mercer noticed. His expression did not change, but she saw the adjustment in his posture, the slight stiffening of a man recalibrating. She left the window and went back to the stove. She had told herself that morning that she would not spend the day waiting to be sent for, that she would move through her work with the same attention she gave it on ordinary days, because the alternative was to give the waiting more power than it deserved. She stirred the midday pot. She checked the bread. Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway 7 minutes later. "They want you in the front room," he said. She took off her apron, folded it once, and set it on the work table. She checked her hands, flour on the right, clean enough on the left, and wiped them on a cloth. Then she went home. The front room at Hart Ranch was not a room designed for comfort. It had a desk, 3 chairs that didn't match each other, a bookcase with a mixed population of ledgers and almanacs, and a window facing the drive that let in good light in the mornings and too much heat in the afternoons. Caleb was standing behind the desk. Mercer was positioned near the bookcase with his bag at his feet, which told her he'd expected to be in this room and had already arranged himself in it. Crane was in one of the mismatched chairs with his hat on his knee, and the deputy was near the door. Nobody had sat in the other 2 chairs. She did not sit in them either. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at Crane. Because he was the one whose authority was actually operative here, and she'd decided on the way down the hall to address him directly rather than performing for Mercer. "Miss Cole," Crane said, "I understand you're the cook here." "Yes," she said, 5 weeks now. And during those 5 weeks, Dr. Mercer's complaint states that you've been providing unsanctioned medical treatment to the Hart child, Caleb Hart's son, Jonah, 10 years of age. He said it without inflection, reading from an interior script that was the accumulation of the complaint rather than his own position on it. "I've been doing therapeutic work with Jonah's feet and lower legs," she said. "Warm water, yarrow, willow bark, and pressure application along the nerve pathways. I learned the method from my father." "Your father was not a licensed physician," Mercer said from his position by the bookcase. "No," she said without looking at him. She kept her eyes on Crane. Crane looked at her. "Was Mr. Hart aware of this treatment?" "He became aware of it," she said. "He is aware of it now." Crane looked at Caleb. "Mr. Hart, you're aware that unlicensed medical treatment constitutes interference under county statute. Did you sanction this woman's activities?" Caleb was quiet for one careful beat, and then he said, "I did." Mercer's posture changed. "Caleb, I'm speaking to the sheriff, Silas," Caleb said, and the use of the first name carried something in it, the weight of a longer history between them that Mara didn't have full access to but could feel in the room. "I became aware of what Mara was doing, and I chose not to stop it. That makes it my responsibility." Crane nodded slowly. "And your assessment of the treatment? What did you observe?" Caleb came around from behind the desk. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides, and he said the thing that Mara had not been sure, until this moment, that he would say. "I watched my son stand up yesterday morning. 3 seconds. On his feet, under his own power, for the first time in 2 years." He kept his voice level with the evident effort of someone for whom level is not the natural register of what he's describing. "I was in the room. I watched it happen. And I'm telling you that what I watched was not a spasm or a trick or a raised expectation. It was my son standing up." Mercer set his bag down. "Aldous, what the man is describing is a temporary, I'd like to see the boy," Crane said. They went upstairs in a procession that felt nothing like what it was and everything like what it was. A man with legal authority and a complaint on paper. A physician who had staked professional certainty on a specific outcome. A father walking up the stairs of his own house as if each step required individual authorization. And Mara, following behind all of them, watching the back of Caleb's neck and the set of his shoulders, and thinking about her father, about the man from the loading dock, about everything that had led from there to here. She had told Jonah they were coming. She'd gone up before the sheriff arrived early, and she'd told him plainly, "Sheriff, Mercer, your father," all at once. He'd looked at her with the specific expression that meant he was more frightened than he was showing, which she'd become fluent in over 5 weeks. "What do I do?" he'd asked. "Whatever you can actually do," she said. "Not more, not less." He'd nodded. He'd looked at his feet. Then he'd looked back at her and said, "Will you be there?" "Right behind them," she said. Now she was behind them, in the doorway while Crane and Mercer came into the room and Caleb stood at the threshold, and Jonah sat in his chair at the window with his hands in his lap and his face doing the controlled surface thing that he'd inherited from his father and had been practicing for 2 years, and none of it looked like what it was, which was a 10-year-old boy who had been frightened for 2 years and had recently been given a reason not to be and was now being asked to prove it to strangers. Mercer went to him first. He examined with the efficiency of someone who knew what he was looking for and how to look. And the examination was not cruel, shishtat. She had to give him that. He was not cruel to the boy. But it was thorough in the way that a refutation is thorough, hitting every point that supported the original conclusion, testing reflexes that had always been absent and finding them absent, pressing in places where there was no sensation and confirming no sensation. "The lower extremities show no substantive change," he said, to Crane rather than to anyone in the room. "Show him," Caleb said from the threshold. Jonah looked at his father. "Show him what you showed me," Caleb said. It was quiet in the room. The morning light came through the east window in its usual reliable way, and outside the ranch went about its business. The horses, the fence, the ordinary machinery of the day, and none of it came inside. Jonah looked down at his feet. He set his jaw. He lifted his right foot. Not 2 inches, not 4. 6 inches off the footrest, clean and deliberate, held for a count of 4 while the room was completely still, and then the left foot came up to match it. Not as high, but clear and intentional, and Jonah kept them there, both of them, while his face went white with the effort, and he kept them there anyway. Crane leaned forward in his chair. Mercer was very still. Jonah put his feet down. He was breathing audibly. He looked at Mercer and said, with 10-year-old directness that had no strategy in it, "That wasn't a spasm." Mercer opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The movement could be explained by "He stood yesterday," Caleb said from the threshold. "I was here. I caught him when his knees went. I felt the weight of him." His voice had something in it now, a roughness at the edges that came from saying things that had been contained for a long time. "You tell me how to explain that." Crane stood up. He looked at the boy. He looked at Mercer. He was a man who had been in enough rooms with enough competing certainties to have developed a healthy skepticism about all of them, and right now that skepticism was visible on his face in the way that genuine thinking looks from the outside, unsettled, processing, not yet arrived. "Son," he said to Jonah, "how long has she been doing this?" He nodded toward Mara in the doorway. 5 weeks, Jonah said. "And before she started?" Jonah looked at his feet. "I couldn't feel them," he said. "They were just there, like something attached to me that didn't belong to me." He paused. "Now they hurt." He looked up at Crane. "That probably sounds like the wrong kind of news, but it's not." Crane looked at Mara. "You want to explain the method?" She came into the room and explained it. The concept of spinal shock versus permanent cord severance. The nerve pathway theory her father had worked from. The treatment sequence. What it was meant to accomplish and why. And what she had observed across 5 weeks of daily sessions. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, because plain was the only language that worked in a room where one person was primed to hear fraud in whatever she said. When she finished, Mercer said, "None of this is medically substantiated." "My father's results were substantiated in the patients he treated," she said. "I've seen 2 recoveries that looked like this in early stage." "Anecdotal," Mercer said. "What you certified 2 years ago was also based on what was in front of you," she said. "I'm not saying you were wrong to conclude what you concluded. I'm saying the situation has changed." Mercer looked at Crane. "Aldous, the complaint stands. She is practicing medicine without a license in a jurisdiction that has clear statute on the matter." Crane sat back down. He looked at his hat for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "What do you want, Hart?" Caleb came fully into the room for the first time. He stood beside his son's chair and he put his hand on the armrest. Not Jonah's shoulder, just the chair, but close. And he said, "I want the complaint dismissed. I want Mara Cole to continue what she's doing. And I want Silas Mercer off my property by noon." Mercer made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The complaint is filed with the county," Crane said. "I can't simply dismiss it on your say-so." "I know," Caleb said. "But you can recommend it, and you can tell the county board what you saw this morning." Crane was quiet. He turned his hat over once. Then he looked at Jonah, who was sitting in his chair with the careful expression that was becoming just slightly less careful. The armor going thinner at the edges, not from lowered guard, but from less need. He looked at him for a long moment. "Show me the standing," Crane said. They cleared space in the center of the room. Mara positioned the chair. She looked at Jonah, and he looked back at her, and there was a communication between them that had no words and needed none. 5 weeks of daily sessions had built a language between his body and her hands that existed independently of speech, and what passed between them now was something like, "I know. I know. Ready when you are." Caleb stood to Jonah's left. Mara stood to his right. Crane was against the wall with his arms at his sides. Mercer had moved to stand near the door, and his face was doing something she wasn't looking at directly. Something that was not quite the expression she'd expected from a man watching his professional conclusion be challenged, something more complicated than that. Jonah put his feet flat on the floor. He leaned forward, shifting his weight to the front of the chair. His hands gripped the armrests. She put 2 fingers lightly at his waist, Not holding, just present. And Caleb mirrored her on the other side, his hand larger and less steady than hers. Jonah pushed. He came up wrong the first time. His left knee folded before the right was ready, and he dropped back into the chair with a sound that wasn't quite a gasp, and the look on his face for one unguarded second was the look of someone expecting to have proven the worst possible thing about themselves. "Again," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You came up uneven," she said. "Right foot a half second before left. Start them together this time." He reset his feet. He breathed. He tried again. He came up even. He shook, the same full body trembling as the day before, his ankles working furiously against the instability, his legs doing the enormous mechanical work of supporting a 10-year-old body that had been sitting for 2 years and had the musculature to prove it. He held the armrests for 2 seconds and then let them go, his arms out to the side slightly, and he stood without them for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, and then 4, which was a second longer than yesterday, and his face was the face of someone discovering something about themselves that they'd been afraid to believe. He took a step. She hadn't expected it. He hadn't said he was going to try it. It was impulsive, and it was right. His left foot came forward, found the floor, held, and he stood there having moved from one point to another under his own power. And then his right knee went, and Caleb caught him, both arms around him, and they were both down on one knee on the floorboards with Caleb holding his son and neither of them saying anything. Crane cleared his throat. Once, Mercer, by the door, had his hand over his mouth. She looked at him. She wasn't looking for his reaction. She didn't need his reaction. It couldn't give her anything. But she saw it anyway, the thing on his face behind the hand. It was not the face of a man who had been caught in a lie. It was the face of a man who had been limited and knew it now, and was encountering the particular difficulty of that knowledge for the first time in what might have been a long time. She looked away. Crane said, "I'll recommend suspension of the complaint pending review. That's what I can do today." He stood up, resettled his hat. "Hart, I'll be honest with you. I can't guarantee the board dismisses it. Mercer's complaint carries weight with certain people." "I understand," Caleb said. He was helping Jonah back into the chair, careful and precise, and he didn't look up when he said it. "I'll also tell you that what I observed here this morning will be in my report," Crane said. "In full. That's what I can offer." He left the room. The deputy followed. Mara listened to their boots on the stairs, on the front room floor, on the porch, and then the wagon starting up the drive. Mercer was still by the door. He and Caleb looked at each other across the room, and the look between them had the density of a relationship with history in it. Not strangers, not enemies, but men who had been in the same community long enough to have done each other both services and damages, and who were now standing in a room where the balance between those things had shifted. "Silas," Caleb said. Mercer took his hand away from his mouth. He looked at Jonah. The boy looked back at him with the particular look of a child who has nothing to prove and knows it and is not being unkind about it. Mercer started. He stopped. He tried again. "The presentation 2 years ago was consistent with permanent damage. Everything I knew, I know," Caleb said. "I'm not interested in relitigating what you told me 2 years ago." Mercer nodded. He picked up his bag. "What I told you then was my best assessment," he said, to the room rather than to any one person in it. "I want that on record. It wasn't negligence." "I didn't say it was," Caleb said. Mercer looked one more time at Jonah. Something moved across his face that Mara thought, if she was being as generous as her father would have been, might have been something close to an honest reckoning. Then he walked out. They listened to the bays take him back down the drive. Jonah said, to the window, "He still thinks he was right." "Part of him," Mara said. "Which part?" "The part that can't afford to be wrong," she said. "That part never changes easily." Jonah looked at his feet on the footrest. "I took a step," he said. "You did," she said. "It wasn't very good." "No," she agreed, "but it was a step." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How many bad steps before a good one?" She thought about her father, about the loading dock man with his cane, about the particular arithmetic of recovery, the terrible patience of it, the way improvement was not a line but a landscape, full of terrain that looked like backsliding until you'd crossed it. "Enough," she said, and then more. The legal matter did not resolve quickly. She had not expected it to. Crane's report went to the county board, and the board took 3 weeks to convene a review. And during those 3 weeks, the complaint remained technically active, which meant that the possibility of Mara's removal from the ranch remained technically available. Caleb Hart, who understood both the letter and the machinery of Frontier County administration, did not wait for the review to take its course. He wrote letters. She didn't know this was happening until Tom mentioned it, casually the way Tom mentioned most things, while repairing tack, that Hart had been writing to the county board and to the regional medical authority and to 2 men who apparently had standing with both and who owed Hart either money or favors or the particular kind of debt that accumulates between men who have helped each other survive hard seasons. "He's been at the desk every night this week," Tom said, after supper, lamp burning till past midnight. Mara said nothing. "Man hasn't done that since the winter after the accident," Tom said. He turned a stirrup over in his hands. That was when he was trying to find another doctor. Writing everywhere. He set the stirrup down. "Difference is, this time he looks like a man writing to win something instead of a man writing because he doesn't know what else to do." She thought about that, about the difference between the energy of desperation and the energy of purpose, and how they could look similar from the outside but felt entirely different from the inside. She went upstairs. It was a regular morning session, or it should have been, but when she knocked and came in, Jonah was not in his chair. He was at the window. Standing at the window, both hands on the sill, leaning on it but standing, looking out at the yard below. He heard her come in and turned his head, and the position was precarious and he knew it, and he grinned at her with the grin of a boy who has done something he technically shouldn't have done unsupervised. "How long?" she said. "About 3 minutes," he said. "Before you think it, yes, I know I'm supposed to wait for you." "You're supposed to wait for me." "I couldn't sleep. I got up before dawn and I just—" He turned carefully, one hand still on the sill. "I needed to see if I could." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, close enough to catch him if needed. Outside, the early morning ranch was exactly itself. The horses moving in the corral, Poco with his broom, the long, flat light of eastern autumn coming across the grass in its thin gold. "What does it look like from here?" she asked. He considered the question seriously. "Different," he said. "When I'm in the chair, it looks like something I'm watching. From here, it looks like somewhere I could be." She looked at the yard. She'd been in it every day for 5 weeks, had hung laundry in it, gathered herbs at its edges, stood in it looking up at the window where she now stood. It looked the same from here, and different, because everything looks different from where you can stand rather than where you're kept. "Caleb is going to come in here and see you standing at that window and have some kind of episode," she said. "I know," Jonah said. "I figured you'd be here first." He paused. "Will you be there when it happens, when he sees?" "If you want me to be." "I want you to be." She stayed. Caleb came up an hour later, knocked his new knock, the slower one he'd been using since the day he'd first come back to the room, and opened the door and found his son standing at the window without assistance, and stood in the doorway for long enough that the quality of the silence in the room changed. Then he said roughly, "You're going to need shoes." Jonah turned to look at him. Mara didn't try to read either of their faces. Some moments needed to be felt rather than observed. "I've been in socks for 2 years, Jonah said. "I know," Caleb said. "We'll go to Dennison's. When you're steady enough." "When will that be?" "Ask her," Caleb said. They both looked at Mara. She thought about ankle stability and core strength, and the particular demands of uneven frontier ground versus smooth floorboards. She thought about the weather, which was turning, and the window of weeks remaining before winter closed the practical options. 3 weeks, she said, maybe 4. If you do the exercises I show you every day. I'll do them every hour, Jonah said. Every day is enough, she said. Hourly is how people hurt themselves. But every day, she said. I'm not arguing about it. He made the face. She was becoming deeply familiar with the face. Caleb, she noticed, was watching the exchange with something on his own face that wasn't quite a smile, and was something she couldn't name precisely, but that she thought might be a man rediscovering the experience of his son, being exasperating in the way that healthy children are exasperating, which was entirely different from the other ways a child can be exasperating. And apparently the difference was something that could arrive in a man's face in the form of something that looked very close to gratitude. She found out about the land the way she'd found out about most things, sideways, through something she wasn't expecting. Caleb had asked her 2 days after the sheriff's visit to take a look at some papers in his office. He needed a second set of eyes on some ranch records, he said. A specific description of a land boundary that had language he wanted to make sure he was reading correctly. She went with the assumption that this was what it appeared to be and found that it was also something else entirely. The papers were spread across the desk, and he stood beside her while she read. And what she was reading was not current ranch records, but historical ones. Old documents. The ink on some of them was faded to brown, the paper soft with years. And near the bottom of the stack was a document that had her father's name on it. She stopped. She put her finger on the line and read it carefully, word by word, the way you read something when you're not sure if you're seeing what you think you're seeing. It was a land agreement between two men, one of them named Augustus Hart, Caleb's father, and one of them named Elias Cole. The document was dated 31 years ago. It described a parcel of land, an Eastern Valley parcel, specific in its boundaries, and the agreement between the two men regarding it, which was not a sale, but a promise. Augustus Hart's acknowledgement that Elias Cole had claim to the Eastern Valley parcel, formalized in writing and witnessed by two names she didn't recognize. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Caleb. He was watching her. He had been watching her read, she realized, had been standing beside her specifically to watch her encounter this, which meant he'd known it was there and had chosen to let her find it in the reading rather than telling her about it outright. "This is my father's land," she said. "That's my reading of it as well," he said. She looked back at the document. "The Eastern Valley parcel, which is currently," Caleb said carefully, "in the possession of your uncle Victor Cole, transferred through a process I've been looking into and which does not survive scrutiny." She sat down. She hadn't meant to. The chair was simply there and her legs made the decision. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the document on the desk and thought about the last 4 years. The drifting, the ranch jobs, the way her father's name had become something that didn't open doors anymore because her uncle had closed them, one by one. With the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the legal system was a tool, and tools were most useful when other people didn't know you were holding them. "How did you find this?" she said. "I've been going through the old records," he said. "After I found the account book, one led to another." He came around the desk and sat down across from her. "Your father treated me when I was a boy, and my father made an agreement with your father, and my father died, and your father died, and your uncle appears to have used the gap between those events to take something that wasn't his to take." She looked at him. "I want to fix it," he said. Simply, without performance. "I don't know what that looks like yet, legally, but I want you to know that I'm going to try." She looked at the document. She thought about what it meant to be handed back something you'd stopped letting yourself want, because wanting things that were gone was its own kind of damage. She thought about the Eastern Valley parcel and whether she'd even know what to do with land at this point, 4 years after she'd last had any. She thought about her father. "He never told me about this agreement," she said. "My father didn't tell me either," Caleb said. "Old men and their handshake promises." He paused. "Though in this case the promise was written down, which is better than most." She almost laughed. It came out wrong, caught somewhere between a laugh and something else, and she covered it by looking back at the document and breathing carefully. "Victor Cole is not going to return it without a fight," she said. "No," Caleb agreed, "but the document is real, and the witnesses are recorded and there's a legal path. It's not quick, but it's there." She looked at him across the desk. He looked back at her with the direct, uncalculating look that she'd come to understand as his version of honesty. Not warm, exactly, but precise, so which was its own kind of warmth when you'd been around enough dishonest precision to know the difference. "Why?" she said. "Because it's right," he said, "and because your father treated my son, and my son is walking, and because this," he gestured at the document, "has been sitting in a drawer for 30 years waiting for someone to find it, and I found it, and now I know." He paused. "I don't know what else to do with that except the right thing." She nodded. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought about the woman she'd been 4 years ago, and the woman she was now, and the distance between them measured not in miles but in what had been lost and what was being, carefully, piece by piece, returned. Outside, she could hear Jonah on the porch. She'd been letting him practice moving with the chair as a support down the hallway and onto the porch where the railing was solid and the floor was level. And she could hear his unsteady footsteps, slow and deliberate and real. "There's a legal process," Caleb said. "I'll need your cooperation. Some documentation of your family's claim, if you have it." "I have letters," she said. "My father's letters. I've been carrying them for 4 years." He nodded. "Good." She stood up from the chair and straightened her apron and looked out the office window at the ranch she'd arrived at with nothing but a name on a folded paper and a skill she hadn't known where to put. "Caleb?" she said. "Yes." "I want to teach Jonah to cook," she said. "When he's walking reliably, I want to bring him into the kitchen." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because he needs to know how to do things," she said. "Real things. Not just walk across a room, but use his hands for something." She paused. "My father always said that usefulness was its own kind of medicine. I think he was right about that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "He'll burn something." "Definitely," she said. "He'll argue about everything." "He will," she agreed. "He's 10. He's going to be insufferable about it." "Probably," she said. He looked at her with the look she was learning to read, the one that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to count. "All right," he said, "when he's walking reliably." She nodded and went back to the kitchen. Jonah was on the porch. She could see him through the kitchen window, gripping the railing with both hands, his feet testing the boards one at a time, the blanket gone from his legs because he'd stopped needing the pretense of warmth. His jaw was set. His progress was slow, the particular slowness of someone working at the exact edge of their current capability, not coasting and not beyond reach. The county board was still meeting. The complaint was still technically active. Victor Cole still held land that had never been his to hold. None of that was resolved. But Jonah Hart was on the porch in the late autumn light, moving along the railing one careful foot at a time. And the valley was wide and gray and cold around the ranch. And the legal machinery would do what legal machinery did. And Caleb Hart was in his office writing another letter. And Mara was in the kitchen watching through a window as the boy she wasn't supposed to go near walked the length of the porch railing on his own 2 feet. She turned back to the stove. There was still supper to make. There was always still supper to make. And for the first time in 4 years, that ordinary fact felt like something worth having, rather than something she was passing through on the way to somewhere else. The county board met on the second Tuesday of November, in a low building in Durham that smelled of sawdust and old paper. Caleb Hart was there. Mara was not. They had agreed, without making it a formal agreement, that her presence would give Mercer's people something to perform for, and Caleb was more useful without that particular variable in the room. She spent the morning of the board meeting doing laundry. It was deliberate, the choice to do something physical and repetitive and completely ordinary. She'd learned that from her father, not as a stated principle, just something he'd modeled, the way he'd go back to his herb cases when something was out of his hands, sorting and resorting what was already sorted, because the body needed something to do when the mind had run out of available actions. She worked the laundry tub and hung each piece with more attention than the task required, and she did not think about Durham County or the board, or Mercer's complaint, or Victor Cole, or any of the things she couldn't reach from here. She thought about Jonah, who was inside doing his exercises. He did them every morning now without being asked. He could walk the full length of the upstairs hallway and back, 17 steps each way, with one hand trailing the wall but not leaning on it. He could stand at the kitchen window for 10 minutes before his legs reported the limit. Last week, he had walked down 4 porch steps and stood in the yard for the first time in 2 years, blinking in the pale autumn light, like someone returned to a country they'd believed they'd never see again. Poco had been in the yard when it happened. He'd stopped what he was doing, looked at Jonah standing there on the grass, and nodded, just once, slow and emphatic, then gone back to work. It was the best possible response. Jonah would probably remember it longer than any of the more dramatic moments. Itab. Caleb came back from Durham in the late afternoon with mud on his boots and the particular look on his face that she'd learned to read over the weeks. Not easily, but well enough. He went directly to the kitchen. She handed him coffee. He sat down. Complaint dismissed, he said. Insufficient grounds, given the evidence submitted. Crane's report. My statement. And Mercer withdrew his formal support 2 days ago. She looked at him. Mercer withdrew. He sent me a letter. Caleb turned the cup in his hands. Very measured. He said the progress he observed was not consistent with his original assessment, and that continuing to advance the complaint would be a disservice to medical accuracy. A pause. He's not saying he was wrong. Men like Mercer don't say that. But he said enough. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Mercer's face in the doorway, the hand over his mouth, the things she'd seen behind his eyes that she'd been too careful to look at directly. I was wrong about him, she said. Caleb looked at her. I thought he was the kind of man who couldn't afford to be wrong, she said. He couldn't afford to say it out loud in that room, but in writing, when no one was watching, he could afford it. Caleb considered this. Is that enough? It's what I've got, she said. So yes. He almost smiled. Then, there's more. The Eastern parcel. I filed the claim 3 weeks ago. Your father's agreement with my father, plus a tax record from 28 years ago that listed the parcel under Elias Cole's name. Victor Cole appears to have had that record altered. The alteration wasn't thorough enough. He looked at her steadily. The county board upheld the claim this morning. The transfer to your uncle is under formal dispute. She sat very still. It will take time, he said. Victor Cole has a lawyer and the lawyer will fight it. But the document exists, the tax record exists, and the county has opened the inquiry. He paused. I sent your uncle a copy of the filing 3 weeks ago. I wanted him to know it was coming. She thought about her uncle, the familiar shape of betrayal that doesn't look like betrayal until it's too late, the quiet efficiency with which he'd moved through the gap between her father's death and her ability to stop him. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. It's not resolved. I know, she said. Thank you for starting it. He nodded, then, without preamble, I'd like to ask you to stay through winter, not as cook and laundress. Or not only that. Jonah needs continued work, and the ranch would... He stopped. I'm not making this argument well. You're making it fine, she said. Yes, I'll stay. The letter from the county land office arrived on a Wednesday in December. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Jonah sat across from him with an almanac. And when he finished, he set it down and said simply, the claim is upheld. The land is yours. Mara was at the stove. She turned. Victor Cole's counter-argument was rejected, Caleb said. The altered tax record was ruled fraudulent. You have clear title to the Eastern Valley parcel. She stood at the stove with the spoon in her hand and let the information move through her the way large things have to. Not absorbed all at once, but finding the available space gradually, the way water takes the shape of its container. The Eastern Valley parcel. Her father's land. Returned now by the same system that had allowed it to be taken, which was the infuriating and necessary truth about institutions. They were the problem, and also the only available mechanism of the solution. Mara, Jonah said. She turned around. He was looking at her with the direct, unfiltered look that had become his habitual way of encountering her. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, she said. Give me a minute. He nodded and went back to the almanac. She took her minute. She stirred the pot and breathed and let the distance between her father's name on a faded document and this kitchen in December close to something she could hold. She thought about what Elias Cole would have done. He was a man who received good news carefully, who taught her that celebration was a form of debt you owed the future, that the appropriate response to getting something back was not joy, but something quieter and more durable. Gratitude that lived in the muscles rather than the mouth. She turned back to the room. I'll need to go to Millhaven, she said, to sign the documents. I'll go with you, Caleb said. I'll stand there while you do it. She looked at him. Different thing, he said, standing there. Yes, she said. That would be fine. Victor Cole did not appear at the land office. He sent his lawyer instead. A narrow man named Fulton, who reviewed the ruling, offered 2 procedural objections the clerk dismissed in under 5 minutes, and departed with the brisk efficiency of a man redirecting his energy elsewhere. Caleb stood to her left while she signed. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The standing was the thing. The simple physical fact of a person being present because they'd said they would be. She signed her name at the bottom of the transfer document. Mara Cole. The same name that had been stripped of its weight 4 years ago when the land disappeared. The clerk stamped it, filed it, said, "Congratulations," in the flat tone of a man who processes property transfers all day. Outside, the street was gray and cold. She stood on the board walkway for a moment. "Your father would have," Caleb started. "Yes," she said. "He would have." They didn't finish the sentence. Some things are complete enough without the last clause. Oh, she went to the Eastern Valley parcel for the first time on a Saturday in late December. Caleb drove. Jonah sat beside her, wrapped in 2 coats and a blanket he argued about until she told him it was that or walk, at which point he arranged it with an air of protest but kept it on. The parcel was 4 miles east, past the creek and the cottonwoods. Her father had described it to her once when she was small. She'd been 6 or 7, sitting on a fence rail, as the kind of land that does whatever you ask it, if you ask it right. She hadn't understood that at 6. She understood it now, arriving in December with the grass brown and the sky white, as the place settled around her with the quiet of somewhere that has been waiting a long time. Jonah got down from the wagon and navigated the uneven ground to the old fence line, his hand going to one of the weathered posts. He stood looking at the land. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something that makes it useful." He looked at the flat eastern section. "You could build there. Good drainage being elevated like that." "You learned drainage from an almanac?" "I asked Dewey," he said, unabashed. She almost laughed. Caleb had stayed by the wagon, giving them space, the particular consideration of a man who has learned to hold things lightly enough to let them breathe. She stood on the land and let herself be in it, not planning, not assessing, just standing on it as its owner for the first time, which was different from every other way she'd stood on land in 4 years. "Come on," she said to Jonah. "You're going to freeze." "I'm not cold," he said. "Your ears are red. That's just color." "That's just cold," she said, and steered him back toward the wagon. Winter settled over Grover's Creek with accumulation rather than drama, temperature dropping 1 degree at a time until the frost was on the inside of the windows and the light went flat and white and stayed there. Jonah walked down the stairs every morning by himself. He ate at the kitchen table. Twice a week he helped with the biscuits, which were getting better. Not skilled yet, but consistently edible, which was the stage before competence. He was willing to put in the work. That was one of the things about him. On the last day of December, he walked across the yard to the barn and back. 40 feet each way, uneven ground, hard with frost. He wore the boots from Dennison's and walked it alone. No one behind him, no wall to trail. Mara watched from the porch. He was not graceful. He never would be, fully. 2 years had left their mark, and some of that was permanent, and some would continue to improve, and the exact proportion was something none of them would know for a while. But he walked with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned not to take the ground for granted, which was not the worst lesson a person could carry into the rest of a life. He came back and stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "Dewey says there's a mare in the South Corral, well-mannered, suitable for someone working back toward riding." Caleb, who had come out beside her, said, "In spring." Jonah weighed the response briefly. "Spring," he agreed. Then, "Will you show me the balance exercises so I'm ready?" He looked at Mara. She looked at the boy who had sat in a room at the end of a hallway and practiced his own heel points after the lamp went out because someone had given him a skill instead of just a treatment. And the difference between those two things had turned out to matter more than anything else. The difference between a debt and a tool. Between waiting to be fixed and learning to fix. "Yes," she said. "I'll show you." He nodded and went inside, 1 step at a time, solid, not holding the rail. There is something that people who have lost everything understand that people who haven't don't. That belonging is not a thing that is given to you. It is not a door that opens or a name that is spoken. A document matters. Her name on the transfer mattered. The weight of it mattered. But the document was not the belonging. The belonging was in Jonah's hands pressing into biscuit dough with the lightness she'd shown him. It was in Caleb standing 2 feet to her left in a clerk's office, saying nothing because he didn't need to. It was in Poco's one nod in the yard. It was in 17 steps of hallway walked every morning with a clay jar in an apron pocket. Her father had given her something that couldn't be stolen and couldn't be transferred by any legal instrument. The knowledge was the part that stayed, and the hands were the part that remained hers through everything, even in the years when she had nowhere to put them. She had carried them to the right place, and the right place had not required her to be perfect, or certain, or free of cost. It had required her to show up and do the things she knew how to do, in a room she wasn't supposed to enter, for a boy that a system had given up on, because sometimes the most useful thing a person can do with what they know is simply refuse to leave it in the drawer. Caleb came to stand beside her at the railing. The cold moved through the yard. The horses were in the corral. 4 miles east, the land lay flat and waiting under the winter sky. He said, after a while, "I'm glad you came through that gate." She looked at the valley, dry, ordinary, enormous. "I wasn't," she said. "When I first arrived, I was just out of options." "I know," he said. "I'm glad now," she said. The flat December light held everything visible without flattering any of it, which was the most honest light there was, and enough.